Welcome everyone to this seminar at NUPI. First, a point of clarification: I'm not Nina Græger. Unfortunately, she was supposed to moderate this session, but she has some back problems, so she had to call in this morning to say, "Could you please replace her?" I'll try my best. My name is Ulf Sverdrup. I'm the director here at NUPI. And we're fortunate to have so many in the room today. The topic of today's speech and seminar is Chinese investments and the relationship between investments and national security. Let me also remind you all that this seminar will be streamed. The topic is, of course, an issue of considerable interest. Chinese foreign direct investments in Europe has increased substantially in recent years, although I think it has dropped in 2018. If you measure the number of paper articles about Chinese investments, they have continued to increase. This increase in investment is generally seen as a welcome development. It's creating employment, promoting innovation, maybe even increasing the tax base. But sometimes there's also some negative aspects related to investments. In particular, if investments are in critical infrastructure, they might have a negative impact on national security. During the last year, the EU has also established a new regulation for a screening mechanism for investments. In addition, several countries in Europe are also setting up or strengthening national security screening mechanisms for inbound investments. The new Norwegian security law also has some wordings about ownership for the first time. So the attention to investments, foreign investments, is also increasing in the Nordic region. And as some of you know, the issue was recently discussed also at the Nordic Prime Ministers meeting in Oslo last year. Today, Matt will give a presentation for 25, 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, and then a Q&A session. Let me also say that today is a bit of a pre-premiere for a research project here at NUPI called the COINS, Consequences of Investments for National Security, that NUPI was awarded from the Norwegian Research Council under the Societal Risk Program. We are currently negotiating the terms of the contract, but I think that will be finalized just in just a few days. And the project will start in September this year. That will be a project where we bring together some of our China people, some of our Russia people, some of our economists, and also some of our international relations scholars, together with the law faculty at the University of Oslo and a group of international scholars as well, to look into the consequences of investments for national security, also how to screen and how to mitigate and manage risks associated with investments. Now, today, Matthew Ferchen will give a talk titled Trade, Investment and Geopolitics, Understanding the Economic Effects of China's Evolving Industrial Policies. He will discuss Chinese policies when it comes to industry, investments and financing towards Europe and in Europe. He will touch on and provide a US perspective on investment screening tools. And he will also address opportunities and obstacles for greater transatlantic cooperation or understandings and when it comes to responding to Chinese investments and industrial strategies. Matt is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. He has written quite extensively on Chinese investments, primarily in the field of Latin America. His current projects examine how China is managing political risk in its ties to fragile states. And he's now from 2008 until 2017, he was also an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University in China. So, Matt, great to have you here. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to your presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I've seen at least one familiar face back from the days at Tsinghua, so that's great. And it's my first time in Norway, which is exciting for me. I've heard about Norway since I was a child. My father is a Lutheran pastor and went to college and seminary in Minnesota and worked in a parish in Montana where there was a large Norwegian population. So it's great to actually be here in Norway with you all. So again, thank you for the kind introduction and opportunity to talk with you all today. As was mentioned, I have a background on both domestic Chinese political economy and China's relations with developing countries in particular, Latin America, and some comparative work on China and Southeast Asia. And more recently, have been paying a lot more attention to the U.S.-China relationship and also the China-Europe relationship. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about how I see recent developments on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of what I'm going to call a sort of pushback, play around with the idea of a sort of emerging consensus on both sides of the Atlantic about sort of what kind of challenge China presents. So I'm going to go through a little bit of what I see as motivating that pushback. Again, playing around with whether or not there's a consensus, and some of that is going to be in this area of how to assess risk when it comes to foreign investment, but also the broader challenge that China may pose in terms of its industrial policies and its other sort of other foreign policies, including things like the Belt and Road. So I'm going to begin with that. I'll go into a little bit of detail about what I see as this sort of these emerging, these parallel discussions on both sides of the Atlantic, and then I'm going to dig a little bit deeper to talk about how much or how deep and broad that consensus actually is, and talk about some of the complexity behind this consensus and go a little bit deeper into that and maybe show how that consensus isn't necessarily all that we may think right now. And then I will make some conclusions about sort of what this might all mean in terms of better research and policy. So I'm going to cover a lot of territory. Hope that you will be able to not get too overwhelmed by all of it. I hope that I have it structured in a way that makes sense, but we'll have plenty of time to have some discussion afterwards. So let me begin with just a couple of the takeaways, which I've sort of already alluded to here. The first is that I do see a mirroring of discussions on both sides of the Atlantic about the need for a reassessment and possibly a pushback against China. On the European side, we have the European Commission mentioning that China is a systemic rival, among other things, and then the United States in its security assessments designating China as a strategic competitor. So I do see that there is this relatively recent, I'd say in the last 2 or 3 years, reassessment that's going on. Again, whether or not that's a consensus, I'll explore here. I do think then the second takeaway is that there are some real questions about that consensus, about the logic of it, and even if there is agreement about some of the challenges, then about what we make of the responses that should flow from that. And lastly, I think all of this calls for more understanding. I think we're at a real beginning point here, and I believe that the project that NUPI is going to be doing directly ties into this need for better knowledge and more cooperation when it comes to both understanding the kind of challenges and opportunities that China presents, but also the way in which there can possibly be more cooperation across the Atlantic. So let me begin with more of a discussion then about what I see are some of the drivers of what's happening in this sort of idea that there needs to be somewhat of a pushback, of a reassessment, or as some have said, a rethinking of a kind of naive period of treatment of China. So who and what do I see driving this? That little guy fell off. Does it still sound all right? Okay. So I think there are sort of 5 categories of actors with certain sets of concerns when it comes to China. And I'm going to purposely muddle who's saying what here. I think that we generally see some versions of this on both sides of the Atlantic, and you'll probably say, well, that's not here, not there, that's specific to there. But I think generally this will capture some of what's going on. The first is the business community, and maybe the most important. We hear concerns about market access, about technology transfer, about intellectual property rights enforcement and concerns on the Chinese side. Certainly, these are some of the key themes that are motivating the trade discussions right now between the United States and China. But behind all of this is the bigger question of China's industrial policy and what that poses in terms of long-term challenges, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. Again, much of the business concern is around some of these very specific issues, but then looming behind it are questions of China's industrial policy and strategy, probably encapsulated most recently by China's 2025 strategy. Next, national security concerns. So a lot of this discussion focuses on issues of strategic or critical technology and infrastructure. There are many other national security concerns, more traditional kinds of national security concerns as well, especially for the United States, say, in the South China Sea. But I would say it's these sort of blended economic and security concerns which are relatively new on the radar screen. So again, strategic or critical technology and infrastructure. And then behind this is the broader idea that China is practicing geoeconomics or economic statecraft in a way that other countries have not in recent memory. So that China is using its economic influence and economic tools and levers of influence the Chinese government has over its own economy on the global stage in order to enhance China's global influence, prestige, and power. A third category is those concerned about human rights. So much of this is focused on issues within domestic Chinese politics and society. So questions of state surveillance, techno-nationalism, again, very much related to technology-related issues, facial recognition, and other kinds of technology that allow the Chinese state to survey and potentially control the Chinese population in ways that were not possible until recently. And then much of this is focused on the region of Xinjiang, but we could point to many other issues as well in regions. But recently, at least in the discussion about this pushback against China, I think Xinjiang has focused largely. Then academia, and I think this gets underplayed a bit. There are growing concerns among academic communities in the United States and throughout Europe about questions of censorship, say, of academic journals that are published in the West, but then had been available and uncensored in China, and some publishers changing their attitude about that, and the Chinese government putting pressure on that. Questions of academic freedom in Chinese universities and in Chinese academia more generally, and the way that that may be finding its way into university settings in the West as well. And then related to this, questions about whether or not Chinese students are being put under pressure by embassies to oppose certain kinds of discussions on campus, say if the Dalai Lama visits, or if there's a discussion about Liu Xiaobo, that there might be a pushback from China among students, and there's concern about academic freedom then in universities in the United States and in Europe. And then the media, and certainly the media plays, I think, a large role in amplifying almost all of these concerns and picking up on many of the sort of negative aspects of them, as opposed to what might be things that are going more smoothly in some of these relationships. And then long-standing concerns about the treatment of media and journalists in China. If you talk to Western journalists in China, you will not find easily a more aggrieved bunch, and for a reason. And there are a couple of important policymakers in, say, the United States and Australia who are former journalists in China who are now in a position of making policy for their governments along some of the dimensions that we're talking about here. I think these are not unrelated. So you have these sort of 5 categories, and I would say something has happened in a way that has allowed them to coalesce for much of what I see happening in terms of the sort of rethinking and pushback on both sides of the Atlantic in a way that they hadn't before. Clearly in the United States, I think the current presidential administration has allowed some of these different groups to give vent to some of their pent-up frustrations over time. But there's a real question in my mind, sort of how these different groups sort of interact and how they've come together, and whether or not they are sort of working in concert in terms of pushing governments to act in new ways when it comes to evaluating relationships with China across all the dimensions about which they're concerned. I put the nature of these concerns into a couple of different categories. The first one is a sense that China's reform and liberalization process has ended or stalled. So not all of these issues, in fact, many of these issues are not new. So questions of intellectual property rights enforcement, technology transfer, market access, or many aspects of human rights concerns, for instance, these are not new. The sense is that China has somehow given up on its economic liberalization when it comes to many of these issues, and that there is frustration that before, if you thought that there was going to be improvement along all these dimensions, now there's a sense that it is stalled or has gone into reverse. On some of those issues where there's a sense that there's a deterioration, we can think of the way in which the Xi Jinping administration has doubled down on the importance of state-owned enterprises, for instance, or the promotion of its 2025 technology platform and industrial policy, or the Belt and Road. All of these sort of capture this idea of the way in which the Chinese government moving away from a model where reform meant maybe less government control over the economy, more marketization. Instead, the state has reinserted itself into the economy and society in many different ways. And much of this discussion focuses on whether or not China has basically become statist or a mercantile power. So those are issues that are that were out there before, the sense that either they've stalled or gone into reverse. And then there's some other issues where there's a sense that China has started down a path that is new and threatening or concerning. And on the domestic front, I think this centers on the idea, again, that Xi Jinping has designated himself in a position where he will be able to stay at the top of Chinese politics, seemingly for as long as he may like. And this sort of breaks with traditions of 10-year cycles of leadership transition in China. And a general sense that the Chinese Communist Party has reinserted itself into aspects of Chinese life, including society, business, and many other areas where maybe it had been limiting its scope. Now it's back. And potentially growing. And then on the foreign policy front, I think the concept of China's new assertiveness kind of captures some of the concern. Much of this, I would say, relates to two particular areas, and then one of them is the South China Sea, and the other is the Belt and Road Initiative. So that there's something new about how China is acting on the global stage. And then in terms of solutions or remedies that are posed, I would say most of them at this point are defensive. So at least from the United States, we see a combination of tariffs, of export restrictions that were already out there, but some new as well, and then investment screening. And then I think at least we see some initial efforts, again in the United States, but in some sense in some parts of Europe as well, to try to prepare publics for this sort of emergent and new and potentially more confrontational, less cooperative relationship with China. I think this is still relatively new, but again, sort of feeding in to all of these issues. So that's all what I would put into the broad category of the sort of motivations behind what I see as this sort of emergent, call it consensus for now, about the need to sort of rethink relationships with China, to put in place some of these defensive mechanisms, as Macron said, to end this period of naivete. So this is, I think there's a whole mix of very complicated actors and ideas here that have kind of coalesced in a very broad sense on both sides of the Atlantic. Pour myself a little water. So let me talk a little bit now about limits to this consensus. And I would say, broadly speaking, those issues that I just laid out, I think maybe I missed a few, but I think a lot, if you talked to people in business communities or those in the security sectors, they'd probably nod and say, yeah, we generally think that these are some of the things that we think about and worry about. There is much less agreement on what to do about it. And so I think that's part of what I think is sort of limits the potential for how far this consensus goes, how deep it is. Let me talk a little bit about some of the ways in which this consensus or mirrored set of discussions maybe isn't as deep or full of agreement as I've just portrayed. I think this all begins with a fundamental tension and contradiction between the possibilities and drivers of engagement and cooperation, and then all of those issues that I just talked about in terms of the logic of pushback. So you have, even when you look at the European Commission's new statements about the relationship with China, much of that begins with the emphasis on how important China is as a partner on economic dimensions, on global governance dimensions, along a variety of different areas. So we have had for a very long time a great deal of economic interdependence with China, depending on where you look. Again, growing in many senses if you look at Chinese investment, but trade flows and Chinese financing. So part of this is about business engagement, about making money, and that still runs deep. Even if you talk to most of those businesses who have grievances of one sort or another and would like to see more reciprocity in the relationship with China, they want to do more business, not less. They want to have more access to the Chinese market, not less. In general, even with the investment screening, the tone of that is to say, let's make sure that we have our bases covered and think clearly about this, but really we need investment. If you talk to most local communities, at least in the United States context, I think mayors and governors want to have more rather than less opportunities for Chinese investment to provide jobs. So this basic idea of the economic interdependence and the drivers on the economic front. And then there's the other element of sort of global problem solving in multilateral settings and just on the global front in general. And I think the environmental issues are at the forefront of this. Others probably even trickier, cyber issues. But there's the idea, the compelling nature of many global problems, which China is going to be important in the resolution of. So you have these sort of two, at least, levels of a logic of more cooperation, of more engagement, of not separating or pushing back. And again, that all sort of lines up against all of these other grievances, concerns that I laid out. So you have this fundamental tension between those, and you see these in almost all statements, even of a more hawkish nature on the US side or on the European side. Again, if you look at EU documents about this, or even some of the documents coming out of, say, commercial groups from Germany, they will talk about, well, we want to do more, we want to have more economic engagement, but we have this list of concerns. So I think that stands behind this fundamental tension that we see about what the nature of this pushback could be, how deep it might be. I think then, if we dig a little bit deeper in terms of how far or how much agreement there might be, not just on the nature of the concerns, but on what kind of pushback there might need to be, I think there are clearly different interests involved. So when I first started to hear this idea of reciprocity from business communities, I wondered, well, reciprocity for whom? And who in these trade negotiations with the United States, if one business or one sector gets their needs met, so it's, say, if the financial services community gets more access to the Chinese market, do they then say, well, good enough, we got our reciprocity? Different businesses might right now be in agreement about in their there are different business associations about, and their interactions with their governments about the need to push back against China. But once their interests are met or their needs are met or they see a competitive advantage in going a different route, how long do they continue to push for these kinds of mechanisms to make sure that China plays more fairly? So you have these, I think, different business interests in particular, but different countries have different interests, different positions, and we see this in particular in sort of EU discussions about, say, investment screening. Countries with just very different approaches, different relationships with China that mean that they have a different attitude toward how this pushback may or may not work. I think there's also an important part of politics and ideology involved here. There is a way in which China has become important in political discussions about foreign policy in different countries. Certainly this has become the case in the United States, so it's potential vote getter, or at least it distinguishes you from others. So I think this has become important and maybe different from what was the reality not so long ago. So I think we're going to see increasingly in the upcoming US election cycle that certain politicians attempt to distinguish themselves based on their approach to China. Now, much of it may be hawkish, but some may say, well, we need to revive the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and others may say, no, we need to make sure that we carry out this tariff and trade agreement in a way that is sufficient. So I think there are fundamental differences of interests and then sort of politics and ideology that play into the nature of this pushback and mean that there might not be as much consensus behind it all as is popularly assumed. Let me end this section by just saying that much of this comes together in the language that is often used to represent the kind of challenge that China represents. So you see in many places words like sensitive, critical, strategic associated with infrastructure, technology, data, and sectors. So what is sensitive? What is critical? What is strategic? Especially at a point where you have these different interests, different political motivations, you can see that even if there is this sort of rising set of concerns mirrored on both sides of the Atlantic to some extent, that there really are some fundamental differences and room for disagreement about, well, what's strategic for you as a certain business or sector or politician may not be for me. So there's room for disagreement here, and I think this is where much of the action is going to be when it comes to the very specific mechanisms that countries may put in place, especially on things like investment screening. So let me talk a little bit about how some of some specific examples of the complexity behind many of these issues. Again, if there's a sort of consensus about some of the concerns out there, there are lots of different approaches to understanding those concerns, and the issues in particular are quite complex. So let me begin by talking about the questions of this basic conventional wisdom that I think permeates the discussion about China, its industrial planning, both on the domestic front and on the international front. I think the general conventional wisdom is that China is a place where long-term thinking prevails, that it has a complex approach to foreign policy that, again, fits with its particular political system where there aren't short-term cycles, political cycles, and that they can plan long-term, and they do plan long-term. And so there tends to be, in much of the discussion that you'll see about things like investment screening, about China's 2025 program, and about the Belt and Road, they begin by saying, well, China has an ambitious plan. And it has said that it is going to be the leader in X, Y, and Z technology, that it is going to build so many trillions of dollars of infrastructure that is going to do all of these things. And at least some of those discussions almost end there. They say that is sufficient for us to be concerned and we must then put in place certain defensive mechanisms about this. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those specifics in a second, but I just want to point back to some of China's own domestic reform and opening period over the last 40 years as an example of why there might be room for some skepticism about this. China's own reform and opening period over the last 40 years has been one where lots of plans were made and where lots of reality did not align with those plans, and where success is often been taken on the part of the party and the government for things that they didn't necessarily plan or anticipate or even want to begin with. So it's been a relatively messy process, it's been an experimental process, and it's also been in which there's been a lot of learning going on, learning by doing. But it certainly isn't one in which China in 1978 said, we are going to create the China of 2019 that we see today. We have a plan and we're going to do it like this. So I think that is something that's important to keep in mind when we think about China's industrial policy, whether it's in the 2025 format or in the BRI format. So at least I would suggest the need for somewhat of a healthy skepticism about reading from the plan or the strategy which China will present, and then understanding some of the realities that go along with that. And I think that actually is much of the complexity of trying to understand how you might respond, because if there is this gap, how do we understand that? In terms of industrial policy and the 2025 and BRI programs, one thing I would first point out is that both are relatively recent. As recent as 2013, right as Xi Jinping was coming to office, there was an alternative plan for China's economic reform and development, and that was the 2030 plan. This was done in conjunction with the World Bank. People who were involved with Li Keqiang, the premier, were intimately involved in the creation of this, and it was much more about deepening and extending China's economic liberalization along the lines which would have been much more in keeping with some of the interests of those who are now so concerned about the direction of China. So there is something happening in terms of the way in which the government in China and its top leaders have decided to not go with that kind of a policy and instead to go with something like 2025 and to double down on the role of state-owned enterprises. But I would offer that this is still relatively new and that the game might not be up yet. So this is also one of the challenges for anyone interested in the long-term future of China, even if people are frustrated at the moment, is how do you understand what those forces are for pushing, whether it's the Chinese economy, Chinese politics, Chinese society, in the kind of direction that you thought was possible even just a few years ago and which now seem to be frustrated. In terms of issues like 5G, I think this is something that in general has sort of surprised many in the West. They've sort of woken up to the fact that 5G and Huawei is something that China is incredibly competitive at, and then questioning of how it is that you're supposed to respond to this so quickly when the platform is almost already laid out where China has dominant positions in many places. But I would counterpose that against other areas in which, again, the sort of industrial planning process has not necessarily gone all that smoothly. For instance, when China has tried to create champions in various areas, whether that's in the automobile sector, whether it's in the solar sector, whether it's the unwanted overproduction, overcapacity in certain areas of the economy. There are all kinds of ways in which this industrial planning process in China has not necessarily gone the way that many in the Chinese government might like. So for all of the success China may be having in terms of positioning itself to be dominant in 5G with Huawei, I think that there are also important counter examples of where this might not be working out so smoothly. On the international front, in terms of BRI, I think the same sort of thing as it work. You can see that there will be some success cases in terms of China building infrastructure projects that everyone seems to be happy with, and then you have a whole lot of others, and this is where we get this term debt trap diplomacy coming into view in the last year or two, where China has this grand scheme of the Belt and Road, but a lot of what you see in terms of the outcomes are some of the projects which haven't gone well, where governments push back, where local communities push back, where money can't be repaid, and then questions of whose interests are harmed and whether or not China actually gains from that process or not. And I would argue, and have argued in the case of, say, China and Venezuela, that China's own interests have been undermined because of poor political risk analysis at the outset and the over-politicization of the way that China has dealt with some countries. So this is, again, just to say that there should be some healthy skepticism and assessment of those areas and projects in which China might be able to successfully launch and those in which are going to create somewhat of a backlash. In terms of what you do about this, and I think this is really where much of the discussion now and how difficult this discussion is. I think we have to think in terms of short-term and long-term. And I think this is where much of the discussion about things like investment screening come in. So I think of these as primarily defensive. And I think, at least from my point of view, having an investment screening process as opposed to not having one seems like a legitimate proposition. What I worry about and what I think is going to be the trickiest is in terms of the scope. How do you make sure that you're not just analyzing every single investment all the time? How do you legitimately understand what are these, again, strategic, core kinds of issues, whether it's technology or infrastructure or whatever, and how do you do that in a way where the scope of the discussion and those kind of core areas are what you're concerned about and not just everything? And how do you make it so, even if it's kind of aimed at China, that it's really comprehensive and dealing with all investment? So I think this is one of the trickiest issues, this scope one. And then the second one, which I will say, but I think is really, really tricky, is how do you make sure it's not political? Because, again, who gets to decide what is strategic or critical? And there are legitimate grounds for debate. I think in the US process, the CFIUS process, I think so far this has been relatively immune from politicization. There is a new version of it in place, and we'll see how that gets rolled out. But in the process or in the context of a broader pushback and of populist forces pushing for more rather than less aggressive actions to make sure that China doesn't come to dominate or unfairly compete, you could imagine how that politicization of an investment screening process or other kinds of issues like what kinds of products or technologies can or can't be exported, you can imagine how that could quite quickly become more rather than less political. And I don't have an answer for how you do that, but I think it's important that if you're going to put such a process in place, that it be as limited from politics as possible. Again, easier said than done. But again, I think things like investment screening are primarily defensive and primarily going to be short-term. The bigger issue behind much of this, and what we think of China's industrial policy, is how do you build your own competitiveness? And I've seen this around the world. Countries that increasingly interact with China find themselves asking, well, China does pretty good at X, Y, and Z. We find ourselves in a new trade and investment relationship with them. They're quite competitive at some things. Where does that leave us? To me, much of what we're asking behind these questions of investment screening or concerns about China being good at industrial policy or doing things that make them competitive, whether fair or not, really reflect what people or countries or businesses think are their own strengths. So to me, the longer term issue, say for Norway, but for anywhere I can imagine, especially the United States, is to think, well, what is it that we're doing that's not just this sort of short-term defensiveness, but how do we build our own long-term competitiveness? And I think much of the debate and discussion, at least so far, has focused on these shorter-term defensive kinds of policies. So let me make a few concluding comments then. The first is just to have a sort of healthy skepticism about this supposed consensus that I laid out. It's really quite new. I have been relatively shocked by it myself. I think it more or less on the US side at least conforms to the current administration. And I think that unleashed a lot of the issues that I mentioned, and people have kind of coalesced around that. I've seen a bit of a mirroring, as I said, in some contexts in the EU, including on very specific discussions motivating things like investment screening, 5G, Huawei kinds of things. So I would just say that these are deeply complex issues where the supposed consensus has emerged really rapidly, and I think has kind of gotten out ahead a bit of some of the assessment of the issues that I was just talking about. I would keep an eye on the US elections. I think you're going to see a diversity of opinion among policymakers, of candidates, parties, about what the policy on China should be. Some certainly might bring up the possibility of more multilateral engagement on things like TPP. I don't know where that leaves Europe. But there are, I think, going to be a range of views and opinions that kind of reassess some of what is the conventional wisdom under this administration. And I think there's been a lot of interaction between these US discussions and those in some places in Europe. If you're interested in this, just last week, the US House had, I think, 5 different hearings. The House Foreign Relations Committee had 5 different hearings with panels of 3 or 4 experts each. I think that'll give you a pretty good, they're all China related. I think that'll give you a pretty good idea of the diversity of opinion. Some of them are regional, some of them are specific to different sectors. So that's just the US side of this. But again, not sure how long the consensus pushing for some of these issues is on the US side, and to the extent that some of the pressure or interest in Europe about doing things like investment screening or reassessing what to make of 5G and Huawei is certainly linked to some of these discussions in the US. So I think that the nature of those discussions is important. Second, I think it's important to ask a couple of big questions. One of them I label as easy and one hard. They're both hard. And I think both of these need to be thought of in terms of the short-term versus long-term implications and these questions of playing defense versus more positive things that can happen. The first one, and hopefully these will be good for discussion, is if China is a mercantilist, is it good at it? I think so much of the discussion about things like 2025, BRI, where China's going, that it's a kind of unstoppable world beater, assume an answer to this. But if the answer is of a more negative type, and the classic liberal arguments about the costs of this kind of mercantilism are correct, then that implies certain kinds, again, of short-term versus long-term policies. But even if they may be imperfect at this sort of connecting the plan to the implementation, there can be all kinds of unwanted, unexpected outcomes there too. And again, I go back to the Venezuela example. I think that's a perfect example of this. But how do you deal with that as a government when things don't necessarily go according to plan when it comes to China's industrial policy or foreign policy? And then the bigger issue, and I think the one looming behind all of this, is China now an adversary or an enemy? And is this what we want? Again, I ask this as much as an American thinking about American discussions of this. But I do not think it's an exaggeration to say that that is at least at play in some of the rhetoric, in some of the discussions. Some of it may seem tactical right now, but I think there are some very worrying signs that I see that this could be a possibility. And I hear this on the Chinese side, and people asking the very real question is like, has the nature of our relationship fundamentally changed? And then from the point of view of Norway or other countries in this region, what's your view of that going to be? How do you work in a setting where there might be this sort of long-term, deep rivalry between the United States and China, and how do you make decisions in that setting? So let me conclude on a more slightly upbeat note, which is that I think all of this that I've laid out in terms of the supposed consensus, the questions surrounding it, some of the more specific issues related to technical issues like investment screening, we're at the very, very early stages of sort of understanding the nature of the challenge China presents, of answering at least that first question that I asked about how effective China is as a country that tries to use these state instruments to achieve these commercial and other geopolitical outcomes. We need more knowledge, more expertise, and I know that that is easier said than done again, but this is a question of political will as much as anything. And then I think there's an opportunity for knowledge sharing. I know that the project that we heard about earlier, that NUPI is going to be initiating on this, is one that would fit perfectly into this category of sharing academic knowledge and policy experience about whether or not you're going to have a certain kind of investment screening mechanism, what should be the broader relationship with China, how to understand what's happening in China. So with that, I will conclude and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm now going to... No, please stay up here.
Okay.
I'm just going to bring up this table here. And then you can stand here. Okay. And I'll join you. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. You brought up a lot of issues. I think, let me start by just 2 or 3 comments before. Worries about foreign investments are of different kinds. Yeah. We talked a lot about Chinese investments today, but in the US and in Europe as well, it also relates to other countries, investment originating from, let's say, Russia or from Gulf states or elsewhere. And it's also about the kind of money. Some are dirty money, some are kind of white banking money flowing into our economies, right? So, but my first question is somehow, why are countries concerned about foreign investments? Some could be that there's a general desire for protectionism, or you don't want to sell some kind of national pride industries or something like that. And there's concerns about how to maintain your long-term competitiveness. There might be concerns about security, and there might be concerns about lack of reciprocity somehow. That is not a level playing field. So the question for us as researchers, how do we know somehow whether these concerns are, and you mentioned this is about the scoping and the politicization of these investment screening. So what would be a good way, or could you provide some kind of illustrations where things have been kind of addressed as a security issues, but it's really not a security issue? It's about competitiveness. Because to me, it's very different issues. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great question. I'm not sure I have any great answers for it. But I think it comes back to the basic question of that you have to ask yourself is, why would we do this? Is it because we have a specific sector that we think is in the long-term interest of the country and we cannot allow foreigners to dominate that, and that provides employment, and or it provides, there are security issues related to it, that if a foreign country, say, could turn off the lights or access all citizens' data. But I think the answer is going to be different for every country in some sense. And at least for me, the bar should be really high. Because otherwise I think it lends itself to this ever-broadening scope and to the politicization of it. The one discussion that I was in involving the CFIUS review process was for Smithfield, the U.S. pig and chicken provider, the U.S. So CFIUS, when it was one of the biggest, and maybe still is the biggest, Chinese foreign direct investment into the United States. So it's a Chicago-based company. It was like $4 or $5 billion, and CFIUS did this whole review and is pork and chicken farming, is that a strategic sector? And they ended up saying no. But
some might say it's very important.
yeah.
Yeah, for national
Right, you
food.
could legitimately have a discussion about that in terms of employment, and you can imagine that the answer to that could have been other than it was. They ended up passing. This is why I worry about how do you possibly contain the scope of this. That's why I think the bar should be as high as possible, and the scope as limited as possible.
Yeah, and you're now located in Europe, working out of the Netherlands, as I understand it. And recently the EU has somehow made a decision to introduce a regulation on screening of foreign direct investments. It's interesting, this is the legal basis of this act is related to EU's trade policy and concerns about the treaty provisions on union security. This is relevant because in Norway this means that as such the EU's trade policy with the rest of the world is not part of the EA agreement, and the treaty provisions on union security is not part of the EEA agreement either. So it's a bit of a discussion going on about whether this is relevant for the EEA agreement, should enter into the EEA agreement. But leaving that aside, so if you were to give an advice based on American experiences on CFIUS, kind of how would you design an investment screening procedure? Wow. And do you think that the procedure kind of provided for in the EU regulation is a fitting one? It's very vague, of course, and it gives a lot of national discretion to it. But the Commission itself is going to do screening of things that are involving EU direct investments itself, EU's own funds, and also for participation in the research programs, for instance.
Well, I think the first thing would be to look at some of the language in the new updated version of CFIUS. So the law is on the books now, but they have to decide how they're going to implement it, and that's going to be rolled out in a little while. I actually, in looking at that, was caught by the idea that you do see a lot of this language of strategic infrastructure, critical technologies, again, and I think that's kicking the can down the road. So in a way, I mean, I don't know where that's going to end up. Maybe the people who wrote that have a much better idea of exactly what they mean, but I think in the US process, it's going to be judges and others weighing in on what that is. I think if you can define those as specifically as possible from the start and not have it then be a fight over, well, your strategic sector is not the one I think is strategic, because at the end of the day, this is going to call forth demands to be protected. I do think that this leads to more, not less, protectionism.
I think, of course, but also in the US case, I think there's not that many decisions where you prevent investments from happening. But it's basically a safeguard, providing more information, slowing down decision-making processes, informing decision-making a bit more, I think.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with this is that some of these issues, I called for more thinking about complex issues, and I would say that, as an academic or, researcher, but some of these issues like 5G and Huawei call for immediate decisions. And in an intense geopolitical climate where the United States has certain interests and is asking for things, and where China is asking for different things. And so some of these things can't be decided later.
Let me have one final question before we open up the floor for discussion. So, and that relates to, do we have the incentives, right? Right, because in some sense you might have a private company owned by private shareholders, and they might want to sell their company to a Chinese or a Russian or some other who are willing to pay perhaps higher than market price for the company. But the security community or the government, they might say that this is not what is in our interest. And after all, we have open economies, open societies, people have a freedom to make discretion, etc. So how far can the government go in interfering with these things, to regulate things? Do you see this as a... if business community is kind of citizens of nowhere, just global citizens promoting their own kind of wallet or Do you see that there's a kind of increased some national patriotism in business? Is that required, or where do you end up here?
Yeah, well, I think that the one thing that this sort of challenge that China presents has instigated these discussions. I don't think we'd be having these discussions like, what are our national interests, what are our priorities, where should we draw the line, when should we determine that a certain industry is so strategically important to the economy that we cannot, no matter how much it's sold for, we would never sell that. I think some of these discussions have lagged. They certainly were more acute, say, during the Cold War, and China is bringing this up now. My concern, again, is that it gets overly politicized, or that you sort of create outcomes by putting these defensive measures in place. One of the most interesting documents that I think is worth looking at in terms of this thinking about how do we understand how to both secure ourselves, but also think about our long-term strengths and making those even stronger, is this German BDI paper from January, where you can see them struggling throughout that document with what they really want. Do we really want to become protectionist? No, we want to work with the EU to strengthen education, to strengthen our knowledge-based industries and all of this. So that's one document to look for, but there's no easy answers for sure.
So this is the German, Norwegian, like NHO in Norway, their paper. Okay, now we open the floor for discussion. See a hand over there. Maria, let's bring straight the microphone here, front here first.
Thank you very much for your insights.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Domine, and I'm an intern at the Netherlands Embassy. And I was wondering, in how far is China really China? Or is there a dispersion or segmentation as well? And in how far do you think China would use force or power to protect investments, for example, harbors or other kind of investments along the Belt and Road Initiative?
Right. Well, yeah, I think this is almost become cliche now, but the idea that you have to disaggregate China, it's real, but it makes all these issues that I brought up that are already complex, multiples more complex. So if you have provincial governments, especially coastal provincial governments, which are extremely wealthy, operate almost as kind of, they work with the central government, but they also have a great deal of, they have tools and means to run their own relations with places, and their companies are the ones out doing the actual business. I think this is certainly an added element of how we might understand why a given company is acting as it is, what kind of political support it has, what kind of financial support it has, which you might not be able to read from the sort of central level discussions. That's just to say, yeah, that's really important, but also extremely complex, and another element of sort of how you would even get around thinking about what they're doing. And a lot of times they'll do things, whether it's the provincial governments or their firms, whether or not they're state-owned or not, that they'll do all kinds of things that aren't necessarily within the guidelines. And then there's others who are so powerful, and this is what I see with the China Development Bank in the case of Venezuela. They're so powerful that no one could say no to them. And they went ahead and did their own deals with Venezuela. And then you ask a great question about sort of what would China do to sort of defend its interests in when it comes to, say, in things like ports. I think for right now there's a sort of assumption that if these things have dual use facilities, that China could or would try to use them when push comes to shove. But I think that's a real questionable issue. And I think on the Chinese side, firms are happy to get more rather than less support from the government by calling something strategic. So they get support by saying that what they're doing in terms of investing in a port is good for, say, Chinese shipping. But then that gives others concerns as well, that that's exactly what they're doing is something that's more strategic.
Okay, Henrik over there.
Henrik Im, I'm a researcher with NUPI.
He's also participating in the COINS project. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for an interesting introduction. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the emerging consensus, because I think you make a very interesting point that we're seeing, some of the debates that you've had in the US being sort of mirrored in Europe. But on the other hand, there's been a much more sort of radical change in US foreign policy, it seems, when it comes to China, especially the sort of nexus between economic and foreign policy issues. And it seems like it's almost bipartisan now. There's not that much challenge to the Trump administration's policies when it comes to, say, stuff like tariffs. There is some, but generally it seems like many concerns are sort of shared by Democrats also. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how this sort of drastic change happened, because it seems like if you go back only 3 or 4 years, the tone was very different. And if you see any sort of prospects of the consensus being challenged, if there could be people questioning whether have we gone too far in trying to push back against China?
Yeah. Both great questions. And I'm still asking myself this first one. That's partly why in doing this presentation it allows me to think about it, because I was surprised by it. I first heard this language, which was really tied to the Russia investigation of Chinese influence operations. This began early, in 2017 or so, this sort of rising sense that China, like Russia, was trying to do nefarious things in the United States, and we really need to be concerned about that. That was a sort of signal to me that something new was happening. But the very nature of the newness of it and its coincidence with the Trump administration makes me think that there was something that the floodgates were kind of opened, I think, and an attitude, all these pent-up grievances. Like I said, most of these issues weren't new. They were added to when Xi Jinping came to office and seemed to disappoint the expectations or hopes that he would deepen economic reform with his power. So I think that there was a kind of coincidence of this, but all these pent-up concerns, grievances, and I think especially, so I think it's a combination of that sort of opening on the part of the Trump administration, and then of a very different kind of willingness on the part of the business community to be more confrontational in a way in which, even though they had all these concerns for a very long time and tried to work through the security and economic dialogue and many other platforms to address those issues, they just weren't being, those concerns weren't being met and addressed. So I think it's this combination, but I think it's one of the questions we're going to ask ourselves, especially if things spiral out in increasingly confrontational way. I think we'll look back at this as the kind of big question of like what happened, because I don't think there was previously a real lobby of as such in the United States for this change. And then in terms of what might happen going forward, I think you'll see the Democratic Party, depending on who the candidate is, I think the Democratic Party will have a different platform and view on China. I think it'll probably revive things that you might expect, so things like TPP. Hillary Clinton was against it, but I think that was going to go through if she had won. So I think there may be a different approach to multilateralism, at least in sort of a regional sense. I think there may be a very different approach on environment issues, environment and energy, which was a core part of the Obama administration, but I think also going back further, that was something where there could have cooperation. And at least then you have a couple of points of cooperation, and that changes a bit the nature of the attitude. The big question is, how much does the U.S. population get affected by this and sort of change attitude about support for a longer-term sustained pushback against China?
Okay, thank you so much. And then we have a question from a lady over to the back there.
Thank you very much. I'm really amazed about how thorough you are, and I have several.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Irene Chang. I grew up in Taiwan. I was a former Taiwanese diplomat. I went to school in America and live in Europe. I wonder, because you're in Tsinghua, I wonder if you're You was.
So I was a professor there for 9
Yes,
years.
but,
yeah.
but I was curious about how open it is for academic research from a Western country working there, and how welcome you are, and how much that you, I suppose they really help. I can see that how deep your gripe is on all this China issue, that it really helped in being there, observing. Because from what I've seen, reading through the Western report, I feel like there's always a gap, that what China intention is not correctly being perceived, or how Western behavior react is also being wrongly perceived by China. For example, we can talk about Huawei, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm friends to many Huawei people. I think they just feel like they're so innocent that they were unfairly punished.
Yeah.
So that how, well, this is the issue. And also I would like to ask you, you didn't elaborate on that you think China has long-term foreign policy making, but you never touch anything further on that. Can you provide a little more insight on that? When you say that you use Belt and Road, an example of Belt and Road in 2025 to say that China's economic liberation or reform has stalled. But don't you think that's also in a different stage, when China feel like they do have the capacity, so that can take some big initiation to use the economy to serve the political purpose? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So let me start with the Tsinghua one. I don't know. I don't know how to explain how. I think that was a unique period in time. So I got hired, and I started that in 2008. So I was hired by Yan Shuitong, who is one of the most famous, but also seen as one of the most hawkish foreign policy analysts in China. But he's also someone who is very eager and entrepreneurial in terms of setting up foreign collaborations, including with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I work. So he brought me in. But I was the only foreigner who was there the whole time I was there, and somehow they just thought I was okay. So I was doing all this research and teaching about domestic and international political economy, including all kinds of sort of critical evaluations of China's engagement with developing countries and Venezuela, and I published about it and did all this stuff, and no one said boo. They just were happy that I was teaching. So I got to have a front row seat, and somehow it worked out. I don't know if that could be reproduced right now in the current environment. I get the sense really that there's less space for that. The long-term thinking issue, I'm just skeptical of that. They may claim to be long-term thinking. It's just that those are claims, nothing more. And it's not that there aren't some comprehensive, fairly well thought out plans. It's just much of the experience in dealing with these kinds of projects, say the Belt and Road, it's so new. Understanding of other countries and regions is so new and so limited that it's bound to run into challenges. And like I said, it was always a fraught and complex and messy process domestically. How would it be anything else internationally? And then on the Belt and Road and the 2025, sorry, what did you ask me about that? Right.
So that's why all countries take initiation of
Yeah.
economic leading policy.
Although,
they're stopped with liberation of their, or reform of
sure, I'm not sure I'm saying that. I think that's the assessment of many groups that stands. Those stand as symbols for the kind of reversion to statism on the 2025 thing and the important role of state-owned enterprise. And a lot of economists, I think, worry about that in terms of the overall long-term health of the Chinese economy. And then BRI kind of stands as this sort of newly assertive. I do have to say I question BRI and why it was done, though. I see it as highly risky. China was doing most of what it does under BRI. It was already doing this. It was financing infrastructure. It was doing trade. A lot of it's focused on developing countries. This, to me, is a very high-profile, almost vanity project for Xi Jinping. Why do it? You see the pushback now. There's a lot of upsides to it, and I think it's a risk, like high reward, high gamble. But I think that there is. I question myself: was that necessary? And are they wondering now, like, why do it so high profile? You're already doing this stuff. So yes, I agree. They're sort of coming out and saying we're going to do these things in part because they are necessary for our own continued economic development at a different stage of economic development. And I think that's part of the rationale on the economic side. So they're not going to let these go easily, but part of it is a question of packaging and the PR around it.
But you say that they are very long-term looking.
Well, I'm skeptical of that, yeah. No, I think that's the image, and I think Henry Kissinger did us all the disservice of making people believe that China's long-term and just playing a different level of, strategy than anyone ever possibly could, except for him. People have bought into this, and you see this in things like Michael Pillsbury. The name of his book. He's one of the key advisors right now at the Hudson Institute for some in the current U.S. administration. He has this book about China's 100-year plan. Fits.
Can I just, I think Arne Melchior just left, but one of our economists. He's been trying to model the rise of China effect on various European countries. It's done a very interesting and what it turns out is that Norway is one of the countries that benefited the most because we get to import a lot of cheaper T-shirts and other things, and the oil and fish we sell to the world market, this kind of prices are going up. So the terms of trade benefit is really massive. So in terms of the welfare gains of the China rise has been quite significant for Norway. If you look at the IMF report assessing the implications or the lessons from the financial crisis, show that the kind of Chinese contributions to stabilize the financial crisis was quite significant. If you look at Volvo, the Swedes, they would say, okay, we sold Volvo. It's a bit painful, but actually they're quite happy with China as an owner of our economy. And also, if you look at some of the countries in Africa or others where they have infrastructure investments, of course there's a pushback, as you said, to some extent. But at the same time, some of these, they have a really hard time funding their infrastructure project. Yeah. Otherwise, it's much more expensive or laborious for them to go to the World Bank or struggle to get funding. And in the private market, it's really hard to get funding. So I'm just wondering, do you see the US as advocating some kind of decoupling from China? Or is this, or should the agenda be more towards how to make sure that we have proper governance regimes in order to protect, on the one hand, the benefits of a liberal economy, and at the same time take care of legitimate security concerns? And to me, it's quite a bit of a governance challenge, how you deal with that. And some countries might be more risk exposed than others, etc., because the way you deal with that. So how do you see this? And do you see that China is becoming more, let's say they are more respectful and they are taking more into account various national security or governance concerns now than before because of this pushback?
All great questions. I think the first one, just this question that there are successes, but I think we have to, any assessment of this, and we're still at this early stage, so much is focused, again, because I think some of this pushback and the politics of it has focused on these negative outcomes, and I think the debt trap diplomacy thing feeds into that. I think you have a very different set of discussions, like those that I am in with Latin American businesses and leaders. They may have their concerns, but they're very generally happy to have a new trade partner, to have the way in which, like you said, China was a stabilizing point even for exports of commodities during the financial crisis. At the same time, they worry about commodity dependency. They worry that China is going to dominate. This discussion you're having about the investment screening is soon to come, I believe, to places like Brazil and elsewhere, and they're watching. But I think there's a variation that we see on this sort of success versus failure of these projects, and we kind of need a better sense of how to define those. So I think that's an important thing to get a sense of balance. And I think a lot of it is related to these questions of governance that you're talking about. And I think the U.S., to the extent that this pushback, and at least on the U.S. side, but maybe also a little bit in Europe, is focused on these trade issues and on demanding that China do X, Y, and Z, and concerns about these things, that it distracts a little bit from this bigger agenda of some of these global governance issues. And then the specifics of governance in any given country where China is, say, developing an infrastructure project. I think this brings back very old questions about governance, about what's a good project, how do you finance it, how do you make sure it's socially viable, politically viable, commercially viable, and these are things which
ecologically sustainable.
ecologically, all of these things are key, and I think that those are going to be longer term, and you have to. And I think because China sees its own interests at stake in some of these issues, there's a willingness to listen, but doesn't want to be preached to. But to the extent that they're actually losing money and or their international credibility is being harmed, I think there is some awareness. So you see more movement on things like corporate social responsibility issues, where they have a lot of their image at stake in Africa. They're especially concerned about it, thinking about things like doing political risk better. I think the one institution you see in China that sort of encapsulates some of this is the AAIB. And yet you'll notice that the AIB compared to, say, the China Development Bank or the Export-Import Bank in terms of the actual amount of funding it's doing for projects is minuscule, and that's partly because they have all these protocols in place for evaluating these things. But I think there is an openness.
Okay, please.
Thank you. My name is Ivan Hoffman. As a retired Norwegian and international civil servant, I wonder if I'm mistaken in thinking that there are parallels between the issues and challenges that you have outlined today and those which were prominent in the discussions about Japan and its influence 50 years ago, and whether there are things to learn from what has happened after that discussion and the situation of Japan today relative to what one did expect and envisage at that time. And I was also wondering whether the demographic imbalances which are now emerging in China will have a significant impact on their capacities to follow up on the more ambitious plans that they are outlining.
Great question. I think you're exactly correct in this analogy. I see so many echoes of discussions about the role of Japan, worries about Japan, worries about Japan's mercantilism, about its investments abroad, about the way that it was able to muster its newfound economic wealth to have more influence. These discussions in the 1980s about export controls or getting Japan to voluntarily limit certain exports to the United States, about kind of reciprocity issues, and from an Asian country, and a sense that that went against the sort of economic orthodoxy at the time, for sure. So, and you see people like Lighthizer, who was involved in the Reagan administration also on issues like this, and you see consistencies there. And I think maybe even President Trump has some of these ideas that were formative in the 1980s about this, about questions of trade imbalances and this sort of thing that absolutely ring true in the case of Japan. And then I come back. This is why I asked the question of like, is China a good mercantilist? And I mean, are they effective at it? Have they somehow upended the balance of what was seen in the post-Cold War or say in the Washington Consensus era, that just doesn't work, that more statism, that more planning is somehow ultimately not going to be effective? I mean, Japan was always a kind of challenge to that at its height, and then it kind of went away. And then Japan was an ally. So you also didn't have that to worry about, and China definitely doesn't fit into that category. So I would say that there are all these echoes of that, and including individual policymakers who have some experience with that. And then the bigger issue, I think, related to that is like, why did the Japan model run into the difficulties that it did, and at what stage did it run into those problems? So questions of debt certainly played a key part in this, and I think a lot of the concerns right now in China's domestic economy revolve around that and the sustainability of that. I think questions about demographics, questions of whether the rural education is properly educated in order to achieve the goals that the Chinese government has set out in terms of being a technology world beater. So many of these challenges that the Chinese government faces, by which China at a much lower level of GDP per capita could very potentially run into some of these very limits that Japan ran into as a much wealthier power. And then what kind of a country are you dealing with? I mean, if the concern now is about an overly wealthy or an increasingly wealthy, increasingly powerful China, what if it sort of stalls, or you have some of these concerns that come to the fore? What does that mean for its relations with its neighbors, for nationalism, for all of those concerns? So I think the Japan issue is one that is ripe for more sort of thought.
You mentioned in your introduction that you had these 5 actors. You trying to explain why we had this turn in the U.S. policy, and you mentioned the business community, national security community somehow, human rights, and NGOs, academia, and then media. And basically you said that there's a bit of a convergence here. So if there's going to be some changes, particularly in the U.S. elections, as you said, where is it of these 5, if any of them, is it that we're likely to see some changes? And in which direction would that be? And out of these 5 actors, which one are the most important in shaping the policy?
Oh, that's great.
Because in order to explore some of the dynamics there, I think we need to understand that if business turns around and want to do more, you alluded to that. Basically, if you can get a bit more reciprocity, they're all in for China again, right? Would that would the other 4 groups keep that back, or will they go along with the business?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do think that business is key in this. I think depending on the terms of whatever settlement there is, if there is one, I think there will be a lot of move to sort of go back to business as usual. I think there's a lot of cynicism on the part of business everywhere, saying because some of the things that the U.S. is asking for and that are also of concern among businesses in many places, things like market access, things like a couple of key terms that are being used in negotiations now are structural reform and enforcement mechanism. It's like asking for structural reform, and the things, some of this being, the China's government's use of state-owned enterprises, for instance. My sense is the business community is deeply skeptical that those will go very far, no matter where this trade negotiation ends, and then they're going to have to make a decision about what they do. And I think some of them have long been dealing with these challenges, and they will go back to dealing with them again and hoping that they can still get some movement. So if anything, I would think they might be more likely to revert to the norm. Otherwise, they're cut out completely. How far does this go before you end up with a point where you're not allowed to even do what you've been doing now in a restricted scope, or you get more of a disconnect, and then I think people will start really questioning how far that should go. I think a lot of the action is in this overlap between the business and national security concerns. This concept I talked to you about earlier of geoeconomics, I mentioned it here. That, I think, it represents this idea that the Belt and Road is a Trojan horse. That, I think, is a combination of security and commercial interests and people saying, let's not be naive. China is selling this as a commercial development project, but it has all these other undertones. And I think that's really important, like how that discussion evolves is important. I don't want to say it's more conspiracy theory, but something I would recommend you read if you want a critical take on this is Chaz Freeman. Used to be a U.S. ambassador, was involved in the discussions of Nixon and Kissinger, and a very, very thoughtful, vocal critic of some of the current policies. And he says that he thinks this is the creation of an enemy. For a military-industrial complex, you need money to flow for technology. And he's not a quack. He's somebody who's been deeply involved with these communities. Again, he's a polarizing figure, but well worth reading on this and thinking maybe there are incentives to create this enemy out there, again, at this section of commerce and security.
Yeah, another way of thinking about the key drivers is, of course, is to ask what are the real drivers of globalization? Can politics stop it, national government stop it, or are market forces and technologies ultimately pushing towards one direction, right? So, but we have a final question towards the back there.
My name is Per Noren. One question. What about American debt? How will that come into this? Point 2, what about the Chinese efficiency? The Chinese, they work very, very hard. Long days, intelligence about 105 in average. Point 3, difference in moral. How is this coming into this?
Depth, intelligence, moral.
I mean, this idea of sort of Chinese holding of U.S. treasuries, I think this is just part of this deep interconnectedness. I think the sense that China has a lot of influence or can sort of hold the United States to the wall with that, I think is certainly been proved to be overdone. But the deep interdependence, I think, is real, and the question of how far you really want to take any of this disconnect. I think that's really what's at play with this. And yet there is a general sense there's an imbalance. The United States is able to run up debt in general in a way that no other country can, and that's much related to the use of U.S. currency globally, trust in the U.S. system, but it also feeds into some of these imbalances, which is also what the Trump administration and some of the American public is concerned about. So I think there are real issues on this sort of debt and the relationship, the fundamental relationship between the U.S. and China. Hardworking, yeah, absolutely. But you'll notice in this discussion recently about 9-hour days, 6 days a week in China, it's not necessarily the case that most Chinese people like it that way. People would like to be able to enjoy their lives. They worry about inequality. They worry about corruption. They worry that those who have the means don't have to work as hard, and maybe it wasn't gotten fairly. So yes, hardworking, but increasingly among younger generations, my sense is that, well, let's be fair about this, and you see part of the interest in maybe living outside of China, studying, living outside of China, is an example of this quality of life issues, including this idea that maybe you could just enjoy your work-life balance in a way that would be very difficult to do in China. I think that's real, but certainly there are some comparative advantages in the way in which Chinese people are very hardworking for sure. And you see some of this in infrastructure projects in Africa and Caribbean and other places. That's part of the appeal to host governments is that you get some efficient hard workers. And then the model issue. Yeah, I think this is like whether it's the economic model, whether it's the political model, I think behind much of this, and maybe this goes back to the Japan question, is much of the concern I think that's out there and behind all of this as China's economic role in the world grows and as it does things like the BRI, is that it's an authoritarian government, not a democratic government doing it. And what does that then mean in a world of mostly filled with democracies that moved in that direction because they didn't want to have the alternative system? And I think that's really what lies behind this, but at least in the near future, China's not moving away from that particular approach.
Maria, over here first for a final comment.
Good afternoon, my name is Talgat Jumagulov. I'm from the Embassy of Kazakhstan, just newly arrived some 3 weeks ago. I don't have a question, just comment.
The time is
yeah,
running.
okay. What does BRI mean for Kazakhstan? Most of all, it's a practical issue and it has geoeconomic implication for Europe as well. Imagine a container traveling from eastern China to western Europe. It used to take up to 60 days to get through 3 oceans to travel for a container. Now, once China announced six years ago the Belt and Road Initiative, we in Kazakhstan started our own infrastructural program as an extension to the Belt and Road, and there is not so much Chinese investment into this program. The World Bank, our own oil fund also participate in this, and today we are, it's a reality, we are transferring containers just in 2 weeks' time from Western China to from eastern China to western Europe via the territory of Kazakhstan, and this is just a purely geoeconomic issue for us, geoeconomic perspective that Europe also can look with interest, I would say, including the Scandinavian.
Okay, excellent. Do you want to comment on that? Kazakhstan interconnection, connectivity.
Just this is something I think the neighbors of China, practicality is so important. I think there's a lot to be learned from the experiences of China's neighbors, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, of just the very real realities of being increasingly interdependent, deeply interdependent with China, and dealing with these issues of handling the upsides of the sort of opportunities that come with that, but also trying to think about security and other dimensions of mitigating risk.
Excellent. Okay, time is running out. Thank you so much, Matt, for your remarks, interesting reflections, also a bit of challenges you opened, you left us with. Very big issues towards the end there, whether we are creating an adversary also, and how to deal with this. And also for making somewhat a pre-premiere for our research project, Coins, on the consequences of investments for national security. And so if you're interested in this topic, our webpage should be kind of ready pretty soon, and there will be more activities on that throughout the year and the next few years. So thank you so much, Matt.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks so much.
And thanks to all of you for joining in. Thank you so much. Great.
Oh, a great turnout.
Yeah.